Hi all, welcome. My name is Ruth Citrin. I'm the Consortium Executive Director of the Cross-Border Conflict Evidence Policy and Trends Research Program, otherwise known as XCEPT. Welcome today to today's panel discussion on the use of technology tools, in particular, the use of satellite and open source data to support research on conflict. Before we begin, please know we're actually recording today's session so we can share it online. And we're also live tweeting. So do feel free to join the online conversation at @XCEPT_research. We are really thrilled to have a great slate of speakers today joining us and a diverse audience coming in from multiple time zones and from multiple research, policy, practitioner, public arenas. What I'd like to do before we dive into the topic of the day is just offer you all a little bit of an intro into the XCEPT research program and the key questions that we're researching. So I believe we're on the cover page, and let me begin by, if you want to change slides, just introducing XCEPT as a multi-year conflict research program funded by UK aid from the UK government. Our research examines the transnational dimensions of conflict, the drivers of violent and peaceful behavior, and how policy and public responses should adapt to address the reality that conflict and instability rarely remain contained within national borders. Applying a diverse array of research methods, both traditional and new, we study conflict dynamics across the Middle East and North Africa, the Horn of Africa and the Sahel, and parts of South and Southeast Asia. The program includes the XCEPT Research Fund, a flexible funding mechanism intended to support research on emerging issues and new geographies by an array of local and international researchers. Next slide, please. Here you can see along the side of this slide the XCEPT program partners. These include leading research institutions and research organizations. Our partner research, as well as our fund research, are guided by a few key questions. First, we aim to understand dynamics in borderland areas, how conflicts connect across borders and regions through the flow of people, ideas, and resources, and how conflict impacts local communities. We look at how experience of conflict alter attitudes and interactions across communities and among conflict actors. We examine the role of memory in perpetuating conflict or enabling peace, and how the mental and physical trauma of conflict links to violent and peaceful behavior. Our research explores how to more effectively reduce and resolve conflict and prevent its resurgence. We bring forward recommendations that serve the policymakers and the public. This can include understanding how responses to cross-border conflict can better be integrated across local, national, and regional responses, how policy can be better balanced across political, security, and development priorities, how borderland areas can be better supported, and how violence prevention and peace building can better address the effects of conflict trauma. Next slide, please. Parts of our program have been underway for a couple of years now. Some elements are just getting started. To learn more about the program, I encourage you to please check out our website, xceptresearch.org. There you can sign up to receive updates on our work, events, and research. So now what I'd like to do, without further ado, is turn to the topic of the day and our main event. That is our discussion of satellite and other open source data and remote methods of research in conflict contexts. Let me offer some thoughts as to why we as a research program propose this topic, or bringing this to you as a topic for discussion. As XCEPT explores the use of these tools, we keep coming back to a set of questions. First, what's the optimal mix of research methods, traditional and new, to improve insight on conflict dynamics and its implications? What are the array of satellite and open source tools, and how do we bring them together alongside qualitative and quantitative data collection? And part of what we'll do today is examine this, sort of get a brief overview and understand better what these tools are and how these capabilities can be applied alongside other methods. Then we ask ourselves, once we decide the new technologies we want to employ, How do we ensure rigor in research and the validity and the reliability of evidence that we bring forward for the policy community and the public? These are, fairly standard questions that underline the research process, but we need to look at them afresh when we're incorporating new methods into our research toolkit. Number 3, we routinely consider research ethics. After all, our research on conflict is fundamentally about people, both the conflict actors and the communities caught in the crossfire. From an ethical perspective, part of what we'll do today is ask ourselves about the considerations we need to bear in mind when we're using these methods to produce policy relevant research. We are pleased today to bring a range of experts together to discuss these questions of use, rigor, and ethics. And what I'd like to do is very briefly introduce the panel that's joining us today and what each of them will speak to, and then begin our discussion so that we have the maximum amount of time for exchange of ideas. We're thrilled that our opening remarks will be offered by Moazzam Malik, and he will give us a policymaker's perspective. Moazzam is the Director General for Africa at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. We'll have an introduction to the use of satellite and open source data in conflict research from Alexander Lee, Director and Lead Investigator from the research organization Vigil Monitor. Nathaniel Raymond, lecturer at Yale University, Jackson Institute for Global Affairs, will share thoughts on the growth and prevalence of satellite data as a research tool, highlighting issues to consider from his own experience in using these tools. Professor Heather Marquette from the International Development Department at the University of Birmingham will bring us back to the research process and how we ensure our choice of methods is fundamentally guided by the research questions and hypotheses we set out to examine. After these presentations, we'll break for questions and discussion. And throughout, please do, I encourage you to pose your questions in the chat. We will circle back to these in the Q&A, and this will allow us to sort of aggregate, consolidate, and pose the questions to everyone on the panel. Then after some discussion, we'll wrap up and are pleased to be joined by Professor Charlotte Watts, the FCDO's, the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office's Chief Scientific Advisor and Director for Research and Evidence. Charlotte will offer some concluding remarks about the use of new technologies to bring evidence to the policy community and inform decision-making. With that, let's turn to Moazzam for the first remarks. Moazzam, if you'll allow me, I'll offer some brief introductory, your bio for a moment. Well, as noted, Moazzam is Director General for Africa at the FCDO. He was previously Director General for Country Programs for the Department for International Development, overseeing the UK's bilateral development partnerships, and was the Senior Responsible Officer for UK policy in Africa. Prior to that, Moazzam served as British Ambassador to Indonesia, Timor-Leste, and ASEAN. His earlier service with DFID included leadership roles on the Middle East and Western Asia, as well as Central and South Asia. He has overseen the UK's Conflict Stabilization Unit, humanitarian programming, and UK coordination with multilateral organizations. These are only the most recent appointments in a long career in and out of government. They perfectly position Moazzam to open our discussion today with some thoughts on what policymakers and program planners working on crisis and conflict need from the research community. Moazzam, drawing on your extensive experience, please tell us what you look for in research and evidence to inform decision-making on conflict stabilization, diplomacy, humanitarian assistance, security, particularly in environments where access is limited and information often can be conflicting or unclear. Over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Ruth. Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're all well and hope you're looking forward to a productive year in 2022. Thank you, Ruth, for the introduction. As you indicated, I've gone a little grey. I've got quite a lot of policy years under my belt, having worked on a whole range of geographies and indeed a whole range of themes and policy issues as a civil servant. The first thing I want to say is that as a civil servant, my responsibility is to deliver evidence-based policy advice to our political leaders, to our ministers, so that they can make informed, sensible choices. That's true, of course, in all policy areas, whether you're working on economic issues or indeed on governance issues or whatever you happen to be working on, education, health, etc. But it's, of course, especially important and perhaps especially difficult in conflict settings. Now, why do we need good evidence? We need evidence. How are we going to use evidence? We're going to use evidence as policymakers to inform choices on humanitarian needs, to allow and enable emergency responses as well as to plan forward. We're looking to use evidence and information so that we can track evolving situations in order to try and prevent violence and conflict. We're looking to use information to document atrocities, harms to civilian populations, and indeed to lay the groundwork for accountability. And of course, we're looking to understand the motivations and entry points for the whole range of conflict actors so that one can begin to think about resolution, mediation, and indeed addressing underlying grievances. And I've seen that range of needs, if you like, for information across my career. And in my current role as Director General for Africa, I see that in spades up and down the continent, whether I'm thinking about our work and our engagement in Ethiopia or Sudan or Somalia, Mali and the Sahel, Mozambique, and lots of other places. We also, of course, need evidence to stop us making mistakes. And this is something I'll come back to a little later. We, of course, in the modern age, our work is driven by the media cycle. We see stuff coming up on the radio, on television, and of course on social media. And there is a political impulse, a very understandable political impulse to act, to respond, an imperative to respond to the situation on the ground. And of course, the risk there is that if the underlying information and evidence base is weak, there's every risk that you can make mistakes, and indeed every risk that you can inadvertently do harm. So the challenge for us in this context is working out how do we create systems that allow us to access reliable information, oftentimes where my embassy teams will have little or no access, where information may be limited, and indeed information may be contested. There may be the fog of war, there may be allegations and counter allegations, and indeed a battle, a propaganda battle, if you like, over information which stretches and tests the credibility of the information that you can get hold of. So in that context, the challenge for my colleagues, and indeed the challenge for our networks, is to produce information and evidence that I think has three characteristics. The first is timeliness. We are driven by events on the ground. We need to be able to respond quickly. We're often responding in international settings, in the Security Council or the Human Rights Committee in Geneva. So timeliness is really important. Secondly, concision. There is a lot of material out there. For senior policymakers and indeed for ministers, it's really important that we present material in a concise way so that they can digest the key bits of information that are required easily and quickly. And thirdly, and very, very importantly, level of confidence. We will often be working very quickly. As I said, the circumstances may be difficult. So we need to be able to judge how much confidence should we be placing in the information and the evidence before us in order to calibrate our response and indeed to try and help us avoid mistakes. So as a merged Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, which brought together the Foreign Office and DFID in September 2020, this is the set of issues that we are grappling with. And as a new ministry, we're looking at how we can bring together the range of capabilities in HMG behind this agenda. So we've got the Research and Evidence Directorate led by Charlotte, who will speak a little later. We've got our network of research analysts. We have specialist advisors in FCDO, conflict advisors, governance advisors. We, of course, as HMG, as Her Majesty's Government, are able to access intelligence. And of course, we have our embassies and their networks on the ground. Back here in HQ, in creating this new ministry, we've also consolidated our capabilities into a single conflict directorate. So where previously we had a stabilization unit and both the Foreign Office and the Department for International Development had a range of conflict capabilities, we've brought all of that together in our new conflict directorate. In the context of the discussion that we're having today, I'm particularly interested in the potential of technologies, new technologies such as satellite imagery, and other such innovative machine-based learning tools that allow us to get at new sources of information and indeed to make sense of new information. Oftentimes, this isn't about finding a brand new nugget that we've never seen before. Oftentimes, actually, this is about triangulating and verifying and giving us a level of confidence about information that we're hearing from other sources. So triangulating reporting from our own embassies, from media, from social media, helping us to validate the information that's before us. And I can say that through the XCEPT program, over the last couple of years, we've already seen examples where the new technologies and the work of this program have allowed us to triangulate information from other sources in a way that has allowed us to take policy action, both with counterparts and parties to a conflict. So there's real power in being able to work with an external group of researchers, but also with new technologies. Now, the nature of conflict is that there are obviously many parties, and in our increasingly contested world, the ability of the UK or indeed of any one country to address conflict alone is actually extremely limited. So oftentimes when we're looking at a situation, whether it's in Ethiopia or the Sahel or indeed in parts of Asia, we are not the only actor. And therefore, having information available not just to us as the UK government, but actually information available as a public source, as a public good, if you like, to inform other actors is hugely valuable. And so in setting up XCEPT, we're interested, of course, in research and evidence before us, but we're also interested in the public good. How do we inform better policy making, not just by the UK government, but indeed by other international actors? There, of course, also lies the challenge of credibility, right? And the fog of war and the risk of propaganda and people, taking the evidence that's presented, questioning it, trying to discredit it. So I think there's some real challenges around that, and I'd be interested to hear reflections from others on that during the course of this discussion. I want to conclude with the point that I began with, really, which is that we do operate in a politicized environment. We work in a ministry, we work in a government, we work to media-driven timelines, to discussion in Parliament, and there is often the imperative to act, to respond. And it's particularly against that context that it's hugely important to have reliable evidence and information for us to be able to bring the real world and reality into those conversations, to speak truth to power, and to try and ensure that we do what is right and avoid mistakes and avoid doing harm. So thank you very much for inviting me to this session, and I look forward to hearing from the other panel members and the Q&A that follows. Thank you very much, Ruth.
Thank you so much, Moaz. Just to bring forward a couple of points that I really thought were very powerful in your comments. It's that, and this is great to be saying this in a public audience that includes many among the research community, XCEPT and beyond, that it's what external research can bring to serve policymakers, as you noted toward the end, and then what they can do using an array of tools at our disposal for the policy community. And there's a second point that I thought was critical because it relates to these use of all these methods, having something that is open, public, shareable is critical. And then I just want to bring forward for our panelists to consider as they're talking about specifically when we get to Alexander and Nathaniel, when who are have a lot of experience in using this array of methods. Your points about timeliness and concision, that's a good one for Heather too. And then confidence. Confidence is an important one to come back to. I think we as a research program are continually asking ourselves, it's that rigor question. How do you need to ensure that you are, as you said, verifying, validating, triangulating, and using multiple methods, old and new, to understand the problem set? There's an additional point that I think we'll probably come back to in the Q&A, and that is, for you for policymakers, when you say timeliness, you need both research and analysis that's near term. I expect you need both long term too. You need to understand trends. You need to see how a conflict is evolving. But I think we'll come back to that in the discussion. In the meantime, what I'd like to do is begin to turn the conversation toward Alexander Lee. And we asked Alexander to join us today as a researcher to help illustrate how satellite and open source data can be used alongside other methods to enhance our understanding of conflict, and he's going to offer some concrete examples of use. Alexander, permit me a minute of introduction of your experience. As I said, he's director and lead investigator of a research organization that studies conflict and its civilian impact called Vigil Monitor. During the past decade, Alexander has employed open source research methodologies, including satellite imagery, to study conflict and crisis response, illicit trade and trafficking, and weapons proliferation. Previously, as research manager with Project Alpha at King's College London, he applied these methods to study non-proliferation and sanctions-related issues. He's also investigated international humanitarian law violations in a variety of conflict contexts. So, Alexander, we know you and the Vigil Monitor team use an array of methods: satellite, open data, eyewitness reports, key informant interviews, news and social media, and other primary and secondary sources to develop a picture of conflict and its impact. Can you explain for us how you bring these data sources and tools together, how you use them to, as Moazem said, triangulate and validate information, what it tells you about conflict dynamics, and then as a team of researchers, what considerations you take into account when you think about how best to present your analysis?
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you for the excellent introduction. Very warm welcome. Please just confirm my PowerPoint's coming through now.
Confirmed.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for this opportunity. Here at Vigil Monitor, we use an array of open source and geospatial data types to monitor conflict, assess its impact on civilian populations. We're animated by the need to improve coverage and representation of human suffering, particularly in environments where access is denied and information blackouts occur. We focus on tackling underreporting or non-reporting of civilian harms. And our way of doing so has been to blend open source reporting and satellite imagery with engagement with local and expert networks. My presentation today will articulate various working examples of how open source and geospatial data has been utilized to provide insight. In particular, I'd like to use this time to highlight how changes in information, what information is available, offers the observer new ways of seeing. But these new methods and tools do not escape a core fundamental problem of research. The problem in question is that research outputs require interpretation, with many forms of expertise still needed to properly place new information generated into context. Too much of the conversation on open source and geospatial focuses on capability. What can it do for you today and tomorrow? Perhaps the conversation should be instead, what is required to make sense of new types of information? Before we dive in, let's go over what types of information open source and geospatial could refer to. We might commonly think only of Twitter and Google Maps, but there is a wide diversity of data types. We are, of course, most familiar with text, images, videos, and audio on social media. That too, also of news media, which is increasingly now coming in many formats, including social media videos separate to main broadcasts. But you should also consider perhaps geospatial cartographic data generated by users, such as GPS traces here submitted by contributors to OpenStreetMap. That too also of transponder data, for example, for maritime safety. And that too also transponder data for aircraft, another example. And finally, trade data from UN Comtrade and bills of lading. And this is just but a subset of open source data types which are increasingly becoming available. On the geospatial side, satellite imagery too has a vast ecosystem, largely defined by a split between low resolution and high resolution. And we usually think of satellite imagery in its high resolution optical format. Optical imagery is that within the visible spectrum, things that the human eye can see. And optical also comes in low resolution. Low resolution imagery is often more frequently captured than high resolution. And we'll come back to this in our example. But consider also there is infrared, which is usually shown in false coloration of satellite imagery to show this band of the spectrum that the human eye cannot perceive. Here, this image shows a January 2015 Boko Haram attack on a village in Nigeria. The red coloration indicates healthy vegetation, whereas the darker coloration shows vegetation death. In this case, false color has been used to show change caused by fire damage. And finally, synthetic aperture radar, SAR, a technique used to create images from radar, which unfortunately we do not have the time to delve into the potential of this technology today. In the following sections, we will largely only cover social media and optical imagery. The following examples reflect a diverse ecosystem of use. The examples may not necessarily be academic studies, but they are current. And the researchers in this section grappled with a similar question to us: how best to use available methods and tools to capture knowledge and show change. This example shows how the spread of camera phones and internet access changed the way breaking developments are reported on. A camera phone in every bystander's hand becomes a record of what they witness. Here, BBC Africa Eye carefully parsed and located footage of the 3rd of June 2018 Khartoum protests, which unfortunately ended in violence. This footage was captured by users on the ground, variously participating and watching the protest. Handheld footage provides some record of the events of that day, and in aggregate may offer insight in describing the shape and conduct of the events that took place. In this case, BBC Africa Eye analyzed over 300 videos, the majority of which were online and freely accessible to anyone with an internet connection. And here, a volunteer open source investigator project utilizing publicly available data from Google Earth and various online cartographic resources to map out changes to towns and villages in Rakhine State in Myanmar. Relying almost entirely on imagery from Google Maps and free imagery from Sentinel-2, the project aimed to and achieved a systematic review of destruction across the whole state. Access to commercial data was a limitation for their study, highlighting that beyond the publicly available imagery on Google Earth, high-resolution optical imagery still remains closed off to all but those who can pay for it. And speaking of commercial imagery, here, Maxa via Reuters disclosed their analysis and underpinning visual evidence of changes in the numbers of troops, Russian troops, near to the Ukrainian border. This was a valuable contribution to the public interest, and this close disclosure of commercially available satellite imagery made this geopolitical development tangible. However, the cost implications reduced the number of analysts working at this level, on top of which we can add one further factor, that of control. With commercial satellite imagery, customers control the capture of imagery. Knowing where to look and when to capture an image remains the greatest demarcation of expertise in this field. But these issues are changing. Data of all of the above types is becoming more accessible, more able to be collected and analyzed altogether in aggregate. In other words, technological developments appear to be changing how we might see the world. In the case of journalism, a shift from set-piece broadcasts to showing but a few moments of footage taken by a journalist to multimedia-rich and spatially rich presentations, which shows hopes of increasing the representation of those who suffer the immediate effects of breaking developments. In the case of the Ocelli project, reporting on changes in Rakhine State, this takes on a whole new level of scale, as the researchers have painstakingly examined the before and after, using information of the after to describe what might have changed. And we can describe this process as such. As time goes on, an event occurs that we want to understand, evidence, and visualize. We seek information of the after. So let's say a satellite image is captured post-event. When we obtain this image, it is compared to an image of the before, so the analyst can study what has changed. This is the standard before and after comparison. The more able we are to describe change, the better the research becomes at understanding the trajectory of that situation is going. At the core, understanding and describing trajectory is the domain of expertise, requiring context, interpretation, and local knowledge. The evolution in this standard empirical process of observation comes with change in frequency. Satellites are getting smaller and cheaper to put into space, and their capabilities are increasing. This image shows the size of a Dove satellite held by Will Marshall, CEO of Planet. Imagery from Dove satellites has been valuable to Vigil's work. We will later show you a low-resolution image that is worse in quality than what comes from Dove, to give you an idea of what is already possible. As satellites increase, the amount of imagery increases, and the frequency of a satellite revisiting an area we want to increases. More images that can shed light on a developing situation are captured between the existing before and after. These additional data points shape and add depth to our prior description of change. And this is not solely limited to satellite imagery, but also to the expansion of smart devices, smartphones, and the myriad of apps creating data from such devices. It is the interaction between the increase in the volume and variety of available data on the one hand, and the need for expertise to interpret it meaningfully in a timely fashion on the other, that represents the primary challenge in today's data environment. It's not the horizon of capabilities described in sensors, satellites, smartphones, but the need for more expertise. Now, having touched upon this issue, we'll turn to an operational example in the last year, where we aim to demonstrate how the increase in potentially viable data was used to first provide a detailed understanding of a single incident, and how that expanded to understanding a dynamic affecting a whole region. The example we're about to show you took place in an overall low quality information environment. Low quality because of the information and electricity blackout, and what information emerged was polluted by deeply held, polarizing views, and access, especially for humanitarian aid, was difficult. Our mission throughout was to generate new information based on visual evidence to help audiences understand what was happening, how often, and where the situation was going. But first, some basic methodology. In all analysis, we start with the overall context. As noted, our example is a low-quality information environment coupled with denied physical on-the-ground access. We honed in on one event, sought to understand that one incident as best as we could. We pivoted to additional events and did the same. And bringing it all together, we assessed and interpreted change, detecting a pattern and a trend. In evidencing this trend, we'd aim to inform humanitarian access and the needs of those affected by this pattern of violence. Put simply, we start with a macro 30,000 feet above view, dive in on the one data point, build out to a data set of many data points, and make an argument that a pattern of events is causing harm. For Vigil, that one context is Ethiopia, especially the Tigray region, which has deep, wide humanitarian needs. A crisis in northern Ethiopia started with a war between the Tigray region and the federal government of Ethiopia in November 2020. The map on screen shows humanitarian access 5 months into the war. We wanted to understand what on-the-ground developments and conflict dynamics altered access, drove displacement, and increased needs. Satellite imagery offered a window to an otherwise difficult to access area. For scale, the red rectangles now shown on screen demonstrate the extent of one such satellite image seen. Contrary to what Google Maps might convey, satellite imagery is not one freely moving canvas of always available images. It requires knowledge that informs the tasking process. We focused on one area of hard access, right in the middle of central Tigray. It's now shown in the green circle. We will recount part of a series of events that increased suffering for locals in Adi Chilo, a small village 8 kilometers away from the town of Abi Adi, and the surrounding area in February last year. In the following example, information was fused from multiple sources, including 3 satellite images, social media, open sources, witness testimonies, and insights from locals and experts. The readout shown on screen is from the NASA FIRM service, Fire Information for Resource Management System. Initially conceived as a public service to detect and therefore manage forest fires, data from FIRM sensors have also been proven to relate to conflict-related phenomena. Here, 2 potential fires have been detected by FIRMs, with the centroid points placed on the road in the middle of Adi Chilo. And to note, this occurred on the 10th of February. After deliberation, high-resolution satellite imagery was requested. The satellite image captured the extent of destruction 6 days after. Immediately apparent in the image was that a convoy of vehicles had been destroyed or knocked out. This was the first phenomena we observed. The second phenomena was that there was a swathe of homes that suffered extensive structural damage, and also the burning of bales of teff, a kind of grain. Both phenomena happened in close time, complicating analysis. It would have been easy to attribute all the damage observed in satellite imagery as battle damage from fighting, but there were 2 phenomena, separate and distinct from each other. The damage was far in excess of what could be reasonably expected in ambush, even in a protracted engagement. Moreover, it was the nature of the damage. Structures were burnt from the inside out, with an absence of connecting burn scars. The pattern resembled something else entirely. It resembled systematic door-to-door burning of homes and livelihoods. This is where low-resolution, high-frequency data came in. On the left was an image on the morning of the 10th taken by Sentinel-2, clearly apparent with bright orange pixels consistent with ongoing fires. This image appeared to match the prior fire detection data from FIRMs. But look at the position of the green circles, which show the same 3 clusters of destroyed vehicles we just showed you. There were no ongoing fires on the road, including where we saw scorch marks from destroyed vehicles. This mismatch was both in space and time. Combined with a subsequent report from one of the conflict parties, we concluded that the ambush happened the day before, on the 9th of February, resulting in destruction of the vehicles and some of the surrounding damage. But on the 10th, the day after, in the morning, there was another attack, likely a retaliation on locals from the immediate area. Additional confirmation came by way of human rights reporting in the Telegraph. Witnesses interviewed gave similar and consistent accounts of mass killings on the 10th, including at Adi Chilo, and giving the names of additional villages affected by violence. We located these villages using local maps. These 12 areas of additional killings are shown on screen as black dots, and their names given. To improve triangulation of these events and connected events, we accumulated additional pictures and testimony from the area that was shared publicly and privately. The red line charts a possible route taken by armed actors in the area from the known garrison in the town of Abi Adi at Teachers College. Arbitrary in the street mass killings outside Teachers College were also reported on the 10th of February. We recognized there were visible and obvious gaps, villages recognizable in satellite imagery, but otherwise unnamed in most public reports. We worked to identify these additional villages, with a blue line now showing a split in the road where perpetrators would have likely split off to reach one of their targets. This very basic spatial analysis flagged an additional 10 villages by name and area that were not covered by existing reporting. To this day, we are still researching the events that occurred in Colo Tambien to understand what other things may have occurred before and after the 10th of February. Unfortunately, what happened in Colo Tambien was not unique. As we mapped out and tracked additional incidents, we began to see a relationship between A, the occurrence of ambushes, which leave behind telltale signs of destroyed vehicles that can be observed in satellite imagery and compared against conflict reporting, and B, the reporting of atrocities and human rights abuses. This map, produced in May last year, shows the extent of known knowledge at the time of both ambushes and reported mass killings. The Colo Tambien area we just examined is shown in the green box. A pattern, at least spatially, became evident once we projected reporting onto a map. And this was also true in time. Unfortunately, the closest in time between an ambush happening and then a mass killing reported nearby is difficult to show in PowerPoint. Throughout, we were careful to be neutral in attribution and only came to those judgments when there was sufficient evidence in each case. But a lack of compelling evidence in each case did not prevent us from observing a general pattern, producing an understanding of a trend, and arguing that this dynamic deepened and widened suffering across a whole region. We replicated this mixed methods approach in another area, which is now shown in orange. Here, you can see snapshots from Sky News footage taken on the smartphone, showing ground level view of what this kind of destruction looks like. A close detailed study of this nature was not solely limited to these cycles of retaliatory violence in the context of an insurgency, but also covered additional dynamics such as displacement and food security. And this brings us back to why do any of this? For Vigil, the tracking and investigation of conflict events is about understanding dynamics and how those dynamics change lives on the ground. Our work needed to both expose developments and understand the harm those developments caused. Assessing and describing patterns may seem detached from the everyday stories of tragedy, but for us, increasing the representation of those who are affected, those who are vulnerable, into the data and evidence used to make these decisions that can alleviate suffering is the point of the research. Researching using these mixed methods can address both short-term shocks and the long-term effects of protracted conflict. And this approach is viable for a range of the dynamics in other contexts, which I look forward to discussing in the Q&A. Finally, why didn't we disclose this publicly at the time? Having just described the public good mission, we have to continually reckon with a balance between the need to disclose and the need to minimize harm. Robust processes to minimize harm in all parts of the research process are essential. Civilian communities overwhelmingly pay the price in war, and their protection also should extend to what information should be shared about them and in what appropriate forums. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Alexander. That was a really rich presentation. It gave us a lot of examples of the use. I know your focus was on social media and what you term optical imagery. Excuse me, all. You began with this wider array of data sources that can inform this kind of research. And I'll note that in the chat bar, and we'll come back to it at the end, someone was asking that question about how you validate what you see on satellite imagery. How do you determine that it's true or false? for that questioner. I'm hoping that the way Alexander walked through his presentation gave you a little bit of sense of some of the methods they use. I think there's more we can talk about this in terms of getting to a sufficient level of confidence to be able to make a judgment about what you think is occurring. That's number one. We'll do it in the Q&A. And then number two is that point that you came to at the end about following these dynamics as they relate to incidences that are unfolding, but then linking them together to understand conflict trends. And I bring it back to Moazzam's point earlier about the diplomats, the policymakers need to understand intent, trends, motivation in order to identify entry points for reducing, stabilizing conflict, as well as access points for offering support and assistance. With that, and actually I'm going to tip for you, Alexander, one question I might ask you in the Q&A. You mentioned availability, frequency of this data, and then the need for more expertise. The audience might be interested to understand what you mean by the expertise needed in this sphere. And then, I note your strong point because I think it's going to link right to what Nathaniel is going to talk about the potential unintended consequences of how you think about sharing information publicly and how. And it's both imperative to do so, but there's also considerations that come into play. So with that, I think we will shift to Nathaniel Raymond. And Nathaniel's going to offer us another practitioner's perspective on the use of satellite data to understand conflict, talking about both its opportunities and prevalence and its challenges. Nathaniel is a lecturer at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs at Yale University and at the Yale School of Public Health. His work focuses on the use of new technologies to address human rights and human security in armed conflict. He previously worked at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, where he served as Director of Operations for the Satellite Sentinel project, which utilized satellite imagery to document attacks against civilians in Sudan and South Sudan. He also was founding director of the Signal Program on Human Security and Technology. Nathaniel regularly advises multilateral organizations such as the UN and leading NGOs on humanitarian response and civilian protection. Nathaniel, as we noted, Alexander's presentation illustrates how digital technologies and satellite data can be used. It points to the rapid proliferation of these methods. I know you're going to tell us that we can't ignore the technologies. So we would value hearing from you the key considerations to take into account when employing such methods. What's required to use these technologies responsibly? Over to you, Nathaniel.
Thanks for having me this morning here in New Haven, and it's good to be here with old friends and new ones. So my bottom line up front today is that whether or not you are using remote sensing in your research, whether or not you are actively trying to figure out how to integrate it, remote sensing's revolution in terms of how research is done is permanent. It's not going anywhere. And my challenge today is to basically say, we're not ready for what remote sensing has done and is doing, but we need to, as a research community, particularly in conflict contexts, get ready. Next slide, please. So I want to start really at the beginning of the use of photogrammetry, which is basically using photographs to measure distance between objects. Really, the birth of modern photogrammetry occurred during the World Wars, beginning with World War I, and then in this image, very famous one from World War II, which is from August of 1944, and it's Auschwitz-Birkenau camp, and it is a pile of bodies being burned that is likely Hungarian Jews killed in August, 5 months before the camp was liberated. And you can see at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum an incredible exhibition on the use of aerial photographic analysis during conflict, during World War II, as some of the first evidence provided to the Allies. This shot was taken by a South African Air Force pilot looking for a chemical plant. Photogrammetry and aerial reconnaissance were some of the initial indications to the Allies that the Holocaust was occurring, and these images were only made public just a decade or so ago. Let's go to the next slide, keeping this image in mind. This is from Sednaya prison in Syria, which was analyzed by my colleague, Mr. Isaac Baker, for the Washington Post. And we can see that though the technology has changed, the use of remote sensing, whether from a plane or an Earth orbiting satellite in conflict settings, has not changed that much in terms of what is done to analyze an image. What has changed is who is doing it and why these actors that traditionally did not have access to these technologies are now using them. So in this case, in Isaac's analysis here, the Sednaya prison, it wasn't being done for a government or an intelligence service, it was being done for a news outlet, echoing what Alex said earlier. And it was being done with a mosaic effect of multiple inputs, not just the image being used. In this case, survivor testimony from those who had been at the prison. And what Isaac's analysis was trying to ascertain is the context of reports that there was mass killing, potentially by machine gun, of prisoners at Sednaya. Next slide. So I'm going to try to summarize the entire history of remote sensing in 4 bullet points, covering 64 years, with the start of really Cold War remote sensing. And it's important to bear in mind that not only the technology, but the methodologies that we employ have its origins in military and intelligence applications. So the plane that you see in the photograph, I put it here just to really remind us that 60 years ago, how imagery from Earth orbiting satellites got to the ground was by parachute. So with Corona's launch in 1958 during basically the Eisenhower administration and the dawn of the space race, the first images were literally shot out of the back of the satellite and had to be scooped by a specially equipped plane that you see in the photograph. It was only in 1976 with codename Crystal that the first digitally downloading satellite was launched. But then let's go even closer to now, 22 years ago, more or less, Iconos 2, its launch, and I make a note of 2 because the first one blew up. With the Iconos launch, we have the beginning of commercial satellite imagery availability. So for some people on this call, 22 years may seem like a long time. For some of us, it may seem relatively short, but the period of commercial imagery availability to researchers is relatively recent. And it's not just the technology, it's the removal of regulatory barriers that by the United States and the European Union that had kept, for understandable reasons during the Cold War, these technologies specifically in the domain of militaries and intelligence services. So when we think about what we're looking at today, it's really about a decade that we've seen the large-scale adoption of commercially available imagery by consortia of academia and civil society. And it really is conflict, not just because we're talking about conflict today, but in the history of these consortia, that it was conflict settings where many of the first large-scale applications and applications by groups of organizations working together to provide multiple types of skills inputted into analysis started to happen. We have Eyes on Darfur with Amnesty, analysts from AAAS, American Association for the Advancement of Science. We have Satellite Sentinel Project, which Ruth mentioned, which I was Director of Operations for and worked with Isaac Baker on. And we have now initiatives like the Humanitarian Information Unit, State Department's Imagery to the Crowd. So what's happening here in this 10-year period where these consortia start to show up? Well, costs 10 years ago, significantly higher than now. Not that costs still aren't high, but costs decrease as download speed, storage space, and demand in sectors outside governments increase. And then what happens? The size of constellations, groups of available satellites increase. And then we get to now, where we have with Planet Labs imaging the planet in 2017 on a daily basis. We have with the CubeSat revolution combined with cloud computing and increasing ability for non-experts to fuse imagery data with their non-imagery data. It's becoming cheaper and easier by the month. That's the moment we are in right now. Next slide. So why should you use it? What is the irreplaceable, non-reproducible value of remote sensing data for your research, particularly in conflict? 4 big things, and I'm going to be slightly redundant with Alex, but you have a multi-year time machine that allows you to detect change. There is no other sensor capability that can do that. And it's really not just about what you're seeing today, it's what you are seeing aggregated over time. And as time goes on, and as the constellations like Planet become bigger and bigger and more rapid in their refresh, which we'll get to in a second, we are having the potential to see that aggregated multi-temporal change effect. And that's the main value. Hyperspectral and multispectral sensing, satellites not only see like us, they see in ways that we can't see, as Alex mentioned. And then I think what's really important for non-experts on this call is imagery provides otherwise impossible correlations with your non-imagery data. So don't think about the pretty pictures here in the pixels. Think about how you can bring it together with data sets you already have to unlock correlations that you previously didn't think were possible. And the last piece is that, and for me, the most fascinating is that you have an ability to detect and document a near real-time pattern of life. And often it's what you see that you weren't looking for that provides insights into particularly behaviors of large-scale populations. And I'll give you one example. In Sudan, we saw houses that suddenly didn't have roofs on it. And we weren't looking at those houses, but we were like, why don't they have roofs? And what we began to understand is that it was a precursor for populations who were about to leave their home communities because metal roofs were expensive. They would literally take them off and load them onto donkeys and carry them with them. And that when you were seeing the roofs go off houses, you were seeing a population that believed they were not coming back for some time. So understanding the pattern of life in the context you're in is often only possible through remote sensing. Next slide. But, okay, we've talked about all the candy in the candy store. Let's talk about the bad news. There are new and increased risks to vulnerable populations, whether or not you use this technology. And you have to be aware of them, regardless of whether you are going to be integrating remote sensing into what you do. You will be working in an environment where people are creating these risks or exacerbating existing risks, and you will be working with partners where you need to be fluent in them. So researchers, and I've done it, many people on this call have done it, have accidentally and routinely provided actionable real-time intelligence. And what I say, when I say intelligence, I mean information for decision support to bad actors. And because often at-risk groups are trying to conceal themselves. And we are trying to see those at-risk groups, and we release information to do good, and we're constantly in a balance of consequences about that release. And we'll talk more about that in a second. One of the biggest ways we can do harm with remote sensing is misinterpretation. Some of the classic examples are putting a national border in the wrong place. Can have real consequences if people start to use that information. If you have refugees that actually are in a country where they are inside a border where they can get asylum, but there are multiple real examples of this, have misplaced the border unintentionally, but suddenly people start using that data and the refugees are in their home country. This data can have legal consequences for vulnerable populations when we make mistakes. And so getting your interpretation wrong can end up also underreporting abuses and negative trends and increase marginalization of populations. What I think is the most pernicious and hardest to detect is that remote sensing may disincentivize consulting with vulnerable communities in decisions that outside actors are making that impact them, because we can see them now. We think we don't need to talk to them. And so we need to constantly be vigilant that remote sensing does not become a proxy for informed participation, informed notification and engagement with the populations that we are watching from 450 miles up. And then last but not least, even accurate remote sensing data can be used intentionally or unintentionally to launder flawed non-imagery data that it's interpolated with. And so we have to constantly realize that when we're looking at an image, or a set of images, we are not just looking at the images themselves. We are looking at what they are interpolated, meaning what is added to them from other data sets. And often that's where a lot of very subtle harms can happen. Next slide.
Now, Nathaniel?
Yeah.
With my eye on the clock, and knowing that you have some important observations to share on the ethical considerations, maybe I'll suggest if we can have you pause here. We'll turn the floor over to Heather for some comments on rigour, and then come back in the discussion period for you to share and highlight some of the ethical considerations.
Sure. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry to cut you off. I just want to make sure we have a little bit of time for discussion. I also, before we turn to Heather, I think it's worth noting that we seem to be talking about a category of use of these tools, and it has a lot to do with the impact on civilians and harm to communities caught in the pathway of conflict. We're a research program that tries to explore these methods in a variety of ways. And let me just give you a couple of examples, because in my head, I'm thinking about all the ways we might use satellite data and open source data. We don't have to talk about them all today, but it's important we consider them when we get to the discussion period. I mean, we've got some researchers that are studying pastoralism across borders and how this intersects with conflict, and they're looking at satellite capabilities to understand climate change and patterns of movement. It still is it's a conflict issue, but it helps inform their understanding of how pastoralists move. There was another piece of research that we actually, as a pilot piece of research we have online on our website, where imagery and satellite data, as well as social media, were used to understand that intersection between artisanal gold mining, human smuggling or irregular migration, and the way conflict actors exploit both of these things in parts of Africa. There are uses of satellite technology to help understand food security in a conflict context, where you think about an agricultural assessment that can be based in part about looking at seasonal planting cycles and the extent of planting in a conflict setting, and you layer that against what you can gather from the field about whether markets are open and what's available and what the prices are. So I just want to make sure I flag for us a couple of examples of the use of these tools that are a little bit diverse and a little bit different from the topic that we're really focused on today, which is civilian harm. And with that, what I'd like to do is I'm going to introduce Heather and turn it over to you, Heather. And what we really want to hear you talk about from your perspective is kind of the rigor and process. Sorry, Heather, just a moment. By way of introduction for Heather, she's a professor of development politics at the University of Birmingham. Heather is currently seconded part-time to the Research and Evidence Division at the FCDO, where she's a senior research fellow on governance and conflict. Her research focuses on corruption, the politics of aid, and increasingly serious and organized crime. She's been a major voice in evolving debates on thinking and working politically. She's an expert member of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime and a lead researcher on a range of initiatives studying organized crime, justice, and policing. She has long experience translating research into policy-relevant outputs, both from her recent work and prior leadership of governance and social development research funded by a variety of donors. So Heather, it would be great if you can come back to the questions of rigor, question of ethics, which I know we'll bring Nathaniel back in the Q&A, but from an academics and researcher's perspective, can you walk us through the process of choosing the right tools for the research question at hand and offer some thoughts about how the technologies we're discussing today can help inform the research you lead on governance, conflict, and transnational and organized crime, and then translate it for use for a policy audience. Over to you, Heather.
Great, thank you so much, Ruth. It's great to be part of this discussion today. I'd like to talk about 3 challenges related to what we've heard about so far today from an academic's perspective, and also suggest some ways these might be mitigated. As Ruth said, I come at this as an academic working on what I sometimes refer to as the 3 C's, corruption, crime, and conflict, and as an academic with one foot in the policy world, including right now a senior research fellow in FCDO's Research and Evidence Directorate, where I focus on a range of governance and conflict issues. So my comments are really informed by that background. The first challenge I'd like to bring up is the risk of being solutions-led rather than problem-driven when it comes to investing in technology for research purposes. In 2020, the economics journalist Jesse Frederick wrote an article about blockchain, which he described as, and I quote, "a solution in search of a problem, the amazing solution for almost nothing." He went on to say, "I've never seen so much incomprehensible jargon to describe so little. I've never seen so much bloated bombast fall so float on closer inspection, and I've never seen so many people searching so hard for a problem to go with their solution." Now, satellite imagery or any remote sensing technology for that matter and blockchain are clearly not the same things. And I'm not suggesting that Frederick's words directly apply to what we're talking about today. But I do think it's important to think about why we invest in technology like satellite imagery or AI or whatever else when it comes to research. A growing body of evidence from a range of fields, including one of XCEPT's sister research programs funded by FCDO, the Anti-Corruption Evidence or ACE research program, suggests that moving away from solutions-led to problem-driven approaches in international development or public policy in general are likely to lead to more effective strategies and interventions, and also to help us avoid potential unintended consequences. If we start with a perceived solution, we may end up missing out on all sorts of things we need to better understand in order to fix the problems we're concerned about. If I can share one example from my own research on tackling corruption and organized crime with Dr. Karen Pfeiffer, we've used this to try to help explain what a problem-driven versus solutions-led approach looks like in real life. So say that we know that bribery of customs officials is enabling illicit flows to get across borders. A solutions-led approach might start with something like, we need to implement a new IT system to tackle border bribery. But a problem-driven approach would step back and instead ask, why is border bribery happening in the first place? Maybe a new IT system is the actual solution, but it might not be. If we start with what we think is the right answer without testing it, we risk wasting time and money on things that don't work, or worst case could cause negative unintended consequences. In research terms, this means being driven by the research question and not the tool or the method, technology-based or otherwise. There are good reasons, of course, to use remote sensing images in research where it's the best and sometimes the only way to gather data needed to answer our research questions. And both Alexander and Nathaniel gave us a wide range of examples for what's possible and why and how we might choose satellite imagery or other remote sensing technologies in our research. But I just really want to stress that this is the what, but not really the right why. The why must be whatever problem the research is designed to explore and possibly to help to solve. It's also important, I think, to remember this why in a world where there's a lot of geopolitical wrangling right now around science and technology, where there may be pressure to invest in tech solutions to solve poorly defined problems, and where available levels of funding for tech may be higher than other, sometimes more appropriate methods. There may even be pressure to award funding to tech providers with political connections. Who knows? It's a really challenging environment, I think, as the technology gets cheaper. And as Nathaniel said, more and more people have access to it. Going forward, that pressure will just increase. But if we keep starting with research questions built around solving real world problems, we can help avoid investing in tech for tech's sake and all the potential consequences that could go with that. Good, open, honest partnerships between researchers, funders, and public and private sector technology providers are really important here. And I think XCEPT are to be commended for creating space for this important discussion today. My second challenge, which I think most of the other speakers have touched on as well already, is the crossover, perceived or otherwise, between satellite imagery and remote sensing and intelligence gathering, particularly when it comes to research on sensitive issues such as conflict and illicit flows across borders. The most obvious differences between research like this and intelligence are who's doing the collecting and analyzing the data and the purposes for which it's being gathered. But that's not always obvious from the outside. When researchers are very clear in justifying the use of satellite imagery, when they strongly adhere to research ethics principles such as anonymity, openness on purpose in the use of the images and of the research, when risks to researchers in the field are mitigated and so on, some of these perception-based fears could also be allayed. And I would actually include commitment to rigor as an ethics principle, as well as a principle of simply of rigor too. Having said that, I think we all need to be clear and honest that research findings could feed into intelligence assessments without researchers even being aware of this happening. Nathaniel talked about sort of bad actors using the research. Well, it could be that official organizations and intelligence agencies could use it as well, and researchers wouldn't know this was happening. As with any publicly available research, once it's out there in the world, we have no control as researchers over who uses it or how it's used. As someone working on corruption and organized crime and conflict, I'm all too aware of this possibility. All we can do as researchers really is to do our best to anticipate potential use and, if possible, try to mitigate its potential misuse. One example, perhaps, of a potential approach to mitigation is to avoid assuming that all of our audiences and potential users will be familiar with how to interpret satellite images, data, and analysis. Some may have deep knowledge of particular aspects of the research, but they lack familiarity with the technology. So researchers can spell out very clearly how to read the images, how to interpret the data, how analysis was done, and so on. But they also can test this guidance out with a range of users before sharing the research findings. And really, this is about research communication as well as rigor. As an academic, I'm very happy to admit that the way academics write about methods may give other academics confidence and rigor, but it can often be difficult for a diverse range of users to navigate. And we can do much better in communicating that to help ensure that the research is not misused unintentionally. Still can't do anything about how it might be misused intentionally, though. Actually, and approaches to intelligence analysis can offer some useful guidance beyond how we as researchers often report our findings, including around things like setting out probability, confidence levels, as Mazum said, and so on. And there's a lot of scope for researchers and intelligence analysts to engage much more than we currently do around things like methods, rigor, and communication, especially around sensitive topics. And while we can't completely remove the perception that satellites are the equivalent of intelligence gathering, by being clear about our research questions, adhering to high standards in terms of research ethics, working hard to anticipate potential use and misuse of the research, and setting out how to best use it, we can help mitigate some of the risks, though we can't remove them. And I think what I'll do is stop there. I have something else I'd like to say about political will, but I think I'd like to go back to Ruth and to Nathaniel as well to see more about what he might have to say before coming back, if that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather. You raised a lot of important points, and I would like to come back to some of them, particularly this, this point about assuming the methods are intelligence methods, and then finding a way to connect the research community and a broader analyst community to understand how to apply these methods, but communicate them and think about rigor. We have a very limited amount of time, unfortunately, for discussion, and because I want to make sure that we come back to Charlotte Watts at the very end. So what I will do is, in the chat, people have raised some really excellent questions. You've heard me highlight an interest in hearing how we can take the conversation beyond a moment in time or even a brief window to really understand how we think about this as an agnostic tool, or these as agnostic tools that support our understanding of conflict trends, and then how you translate that for policy and public to take to adapt responses and take action. But in the short period that we have, let's raise a couple of points that came out in the chat. One comes back to this point of ethics. An FCDO colleague really asked about how do you think about, and I think Nathaniel was going to come to this as well. So maybe Alexander and Nathaniel, very briefly, when you have a body of analysis or research that tells you that something is occurring and you want to present the findings, how do you think about the ethical risks involved in sharing it publicly or bringing it to the UN for action? If you can each take maybe 2 minutes to think about that. And then I'm going to group a couple of questions because it's possible in this brief period you can answer a few of them. There's another very important point that came up, and I think it's critical for research programs. This all sounds very remote, far away, divorced from what's happening on the ground. Another FCDO colleague asked about how do you give voice to those that are actually on the ground? And that's, I think, core to what we're trying to do, mix data from the field with what you're doing remotely. But that it includes the point here, the part of the question was, it's not just voices from the ground, it's those that actually can be trained to use some of the open source methods better, in the same way that you were talking about those handheld cameras, gathering, collecting information that can be utilized to understand what's happening in a place that most people can't access. Let me leave it at those two questions. One is about voice and mixing sources, and that should also speak to your validation triangulation points earlier that everyone was making. The second one is about ethics and sharing, and what do you do with this data when you really want to get the message out. So if we can turn quickly, Alexander and Nathaniel, just to these points, and then we'll see if we have time for some additional questions from there.
On the question of public disclosure, it's a really tough one, of course. 3 overlapping logics. You have first your guardrails against harm. Guardrails against harm don't necessarily tell you what to do, however, they just tell you what not to do. The second is to what degree you're plugged into a chain of action, right? And so, particularly speaking to a lot of the wonderful open source investigators here in the audience today, and research just for publication's sake is necessarily hype driven, and trying to find ways to connect outputs meaningfully to chains of action, I think is absolutely critical. So within that, it's an operational context, whether the researcher has already been plugged into some kind of chain of action. And the third one really is on what can be done. There's a practicality question here, and that's not to wax lyrical about solipsism as what can be done. it's about being realistic about what it is we're hoping to demonstrate and show in evidence, and how that's moving and shaping with things that are already happening. So when nothing is happening, yes, something that's an icebreaker can be a have great effect. Over to you, Natty.
I have released data that has caused harm, and I've released data in the case of Sudan that caused harm that we were trying to mitigate at the time, which was related to road construction that we thought was a precursor for Sudan armed forces under Bashir moving tanks into the Kauda Valley. And so we de-identified the images and the location of Chinese nationals who were building the roads. And they were attacked by Sudan People's Liberation Army North within approximately, I believe, 36 to 48 hours after the release of the report, and kidnapped. And civilians were caught in the crossfire as part of the kidnapping of the road crews. Why I bring this up is that you have to, when you are releasing information in a conflict context, you constantly have to remind yourself that you will never be Nostradamus. You will not be able to know how actors that are indigenous to that space tactically can leverage what you release in ways that you can't imagine, and you'll never get to 100%. And so to echo what Alex was saying is that you never do it just to do it. It must be 100% focused on a specific outcome, and you must be ready to be accountable for your calculation on that outcome to be 100% wrong. Now, flipping this, the research ethics we have in the academy do not deal with these threats at all. IRBs, and I've written about this in Nature, that institutional review boards will exempt this research even when we could very clearly show that it could cause direct harm. And it'll exempt it because it doesn't involve PII, personally identifiable information. It involves something that in my writing I've termed DII, demographically identifiable information. And DII is really the engine in artificial intelligence. It's the engine in this type of analysis of remote sensing, but there is no ethical agreement on what constitutes DII and whether DII is protected. And so because IRBs don't think about populations in this way, in population-based data, they're thinking about individuals and individual data, our IRB architecture is entirely ineffectual as preventing these harms. And so it puts an undue burden on the researcher themselves to have to engage in a higher level of ethical self-policing than our academic institutions are capable of doing because of the data that's involved. Over.
Thanks, Nathaniel and Alexander. Moazam, I see you coming on screen, and I'm going to assume that based on all the points you've raised so far, this concept of voice from the ground, the ethics, and your, as a policymaker, your need, you have like a minute or two of comment that you want to share with us, just listening to the use of these tools and the use of them in different contexts before we turn to Charlotte to wrap us up.
Thank you, Ruth. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I've really enjoyed hearing the comments from colleagues on the panel. Clearly, there are some really complex ethical issues in terms of releasing data and not releasing data, and how data is used. And it's good to hear that fully exposed. I guess the comment that I wanted to make was that in most of the kinds of settings that we're talking about, we're living through quite dynamic developments, right? So we will be hearing about developments on the ground from social media of various descriptions, from news media, from diplomatic reporting, and so on. And so the ethical dilemmas that we've heard about, are playing out in real time. And I appreciate that there are some complex ethical considerations that need to be worked through, but I guess for me, the challenge is how do we intersect that with the reality of what's going on the ground? So, do you withhold the potential of remote sensing information because it may do harm, but actually that harm may play out anyway based on other sources of data? So I think there are some really complex issues raised today, and certainly as a policymaker, I'm interested in having the best information available from all sources in order to try and make effective policy choices. There are ethical considerations around a lot of that. But I think this is a conversation that we need to continue to have. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Moaz. Heather, I'm sorry we don't have time to come back to you to answer a few more questions, but I want to really turn to Charlotte for some concluding remarks. Charlotte Watts, Chief Scientific Advisor and Director for Research and Evidence at FCDO. Bring us back to this point about how the evidence can serve the policy community and how we think about rigor and how we apply these methods. Thank you, Charlotte.
Yeah. Sure, thank you. And a really great session. So thank you to everybody. I must say, it's made me think about so many aspects of how the opportunities of satellite data in this area, but also, really start flesh out some of the challenges as well. I mean, just as a scene setter, building on Mozam's introduction, say we are supporting this research, and it's actually one of our most ambitious research programs in conflict that we've ever supported, because of the importance of us really testing and getting rigorous learning about how not only the dynamics of conflict, which are a major driver of extreme poverty and humanitarian need, but also because we do need to start engaging and thinking about what are the real opportunities of satellite imagery, of geospatial data, of other technologies, but also dig into what are those ethical issues that we need to be aware of. I mean, a couple of reflections on the speakers. I mean, Alexandra, I really appreciated the applications that you were sharing. And I think, for me, what was important is not only kind of seeing in practice what that insights it can give you, but also with that conceptualization that you're bringing to that, about how you think about interpreting, but also extrapolating out data to help us get that bigger picture. And I think for me, that's a really important part of, if we're thinking about future need, about what are the sort of actions we want to take, getting the big picture as well as responding to the immediate picture that hits the press, for example, is a really important element of that. Nathaniel, I was really struck also about your comments about the breadth of information we can get from satellites. I think I knew that, but actually seeing that think through was useful. I feel very aware as a researcher that spent my career working on violence against women, is in research, we do have that risk often of both intentional and unintentional consequences. And I also feel aware of the limitations of IRB systems that often they're behind, I think, the curve of where the cutting edge of research is taking us. So I do think the sort of points and the sort of lessons from this research where we are openly talking about this is really, really helpful. And we need to be thinking about that not only for how we support further research, further applications of this, but also how do we try and support the research systems that we have in place to guard and to make sure research is ethical, are actually up to date and are adapting over time. Heather, yeah, I very much appreciate your comment about technologies trying to find a problem, and at FCDO, our focus is very much what is the major problem where R&D can make a difference, where technology might have a role to play. But as you say, and as we're seeing in this conversation, often it's in support of, to complement the other trusted, established methods, and clearly issues of purpose, rigor, and the need for continued community engagement when we're working on sensitive issues just can't be replaced by an appropriate or convenient tech solution. I do think, and I want to congratulate the researchers to bringing out the ethical issues. I think there's some quite difficult issues coming out from the examples we've seen. And I just want to continue to encourage this conversation. This has been a great landmark conversation, but let's continue this discussion. Let's continue to pull out this learning alongside the applications that we will get through the research as well. XCEPT is at an early stages. So lastly, I just want to say thank you for the work you've done to date for this session, but also really looking forward to the new research, the new insights that you're going to produce over the course of the programme. So thank you, and thank you everybody for joining.
Thank you, Charlotte. Awesome. For taking time out of what we know are very, very busy schedules to join us for this conversation today. Alexander and Nathaniel and Heather for teaching us more about the methods and the considerations around them. For everybody in the audience, you asked some great questions. We couldn't get to them all. And even the ones we did, we barely did it in any depth. But as Charlotte rightly points out, we're just at the beginning of our journey, and we are beginning the exploration and use of these methods. We're going to keep coming back on the issues, find ways to address the questions that you raised, whether it's through blogs or other chats or informal workshops. I would urge everybody who's online, if you can, please sign up at the website for newsletters and for any announcements about other research coming out. And we will aim to keep this challenging conversation going. So thank you for an hour and a half of your time today, and look forward to the ongoing research. Thank you all.